Thomas Becket stood frozen in the torn-up soil, the scent of crushed gardenias thick in the air, staring at the ruins of what used to be his dream shooting range. Bulldozed berms, splintered walls, and mangled signs lay in a heap destroyed without warning while he was away for just one weekend. In that moment, surrounded by silence and violation, he didn't feel rage, he felt resolve and the promise of a reckoning to come. When Thomas Becket retired at 57, he didn't dream of cruises or golf. He dreamed of silence, of wildflowers swaying in the Georgia breeze, of steel targets ringing in the distance as he fired crisp, precise shots at the range he had always wanted. After decades serving as a U.S. Army marksmanship instructor, Thomas didn't crave attention. What he craved was peace, a patch of land he could call his own, where the rhythms of nature replaced the clamor of command. Gardenia Grove looked like the perfect place. Nestled just beyond the city limits, the semi-rural neighborhood had a forgotten charm with winding gravel roads, patches of overgrown wildflowers, and homes tucked far enough apart for privacy, but close enough to wave. When he found the 6-acre property framed in dogwoods and scattered with blooming gardenia bushes, he knew it was home. The property technically fell under the Gardenia Grove HOA, but no one seemed to care. The realtor, a chatty man with 2 white teeth and a love for sweet tea, assured him the HOA was basically dead, a leftover from when the area first broke ground decades ago. The bylaws were old, dusty, and mostly unenforced. As long as you kept your grass trimmed and didn't start raising alpacas, no one would bother you. That was more than fine by Thomas. After moving in, he spent the first few months tending to the gardenias, which had grown wild and stubborn in the back corner of the lot. He restored the broken fence, fixed up the porch, and introduced himself to a few neighbors, retirees, gardeners, and one Vietnam vet who still grilled every Friday. The community was friendly if quiet. More than once, someone mentioned they were glad to see someone finally living on the flower lot again. When Thomas brought up the idea of building a private shooting range deep in the woods behind the house, most folks just nodded. A few were curious. One even joked about brushing up on their skills if Thomas ever decided to offer lessons. No one objected. Not out loud anyway. Thomas wasn't reckless. He didn't just throw some sandbags in the yard and call it a range. He hired a private contractor who specialized in civilian shooting setups. They built tall berms from compacted soil and reinforced them with timber walls. A layer of sound-dampening panels surrounded the range, carefully designed to limit noise pollution. Every inch of the facility was built well within the property line. Bright yellow warning signs were posted. Thomas even ran his blueprints past a local firearms safety consultant just to be thorough. When construction began, a few curious neighbors stopped by to watch. They asked questions about the materials, the layout, and whether it would be open for others to try. Thomas kept things professional but polite. He offered safety briefings. He explained the hours he'd be using it. Everything was respectful, quiet, and completely within legal bounds. But not everyone saw it that way. Eleanor Granger, 61, had recently moved into a pale yellow cottage near the front entrance of Gardenia Grove. Though no one remembered voting for her, she had quickly dubbed herself compliance officer of the long-dormant HOA. Residents whispered about her in polite tones, calling her the Orchid Warden, thanks to her obsessive flower blog and her habit of leaving passive-aggressive notes about non-conforming foliage in people's mailboxes. Eleanor didn't come by during construction. She didn't ask questions or voice concerns. Instead, a week after Thomas completed his first test run at the range, she arrived unannounced with a binder under one arm and a scowl that could crack glass. She didn't greet him. She simply shoved a wrinkled copy of the HOA guidelines at his chest and declared that his range was a violation of the community aesthetic and a threat to tranquility. Thomas tried to reason with her. He explained the safety measures, the legal clearances, the placement of the range. He even invited her to come walk the site and see for herself. She refused. Guns, she said, had no place among blooming roses and Sunday tea. "This is Gardenia Grove," she snapped. "Not Fort Benning." From that moment on, it was war, though Thomas didn't know it yet. Over the next few weeks, strange things began happening. Anonymous complaints were filed. He received a notice of non-compliance for unauthorized noise disturbances, despite never firing more than 3 or 4 test rounds a week. One morning, a sign appeared on the HOA bulletin board near the mailboxes: "Preserve the peace. Say no to gunfire in Gardenia Grove." No one signed it, but Thomas knew whose hand had written it. He kept his cool. He sent formal letters. He attached documentation, safety reports, and photographic proof that the range did not violate any state or local laws. His lawyer confirmed he was on solid legal ground. Still, the warnings kept coming, this time in bright red ink. Then just before Easter, Eleanor called an emergency HOA board meeting. The HOA, long considered a ghost, suddenly sprang to life. In a rushed, questionably legal vote, a new rule was passed. No discharge of firearms or maintenance of shooting-related structures within HOA bounds. The rule was clearly tailored to target Thomas and only Thomas. But his range had already been built. According to Georgia state law, existing structures couldn't be retroactively outlawed by HOA amendments. He believed he was safe, until the weekend he went to visit his daughter in Athens. Just 2 days. When he returned, it was gone. The shooting range, months of planning, weeks of construction, and tens of thousands of dollars, lay in broken, bulldozed pieces. The berms were leveled, the walls splintered, the signs were torn up and scattered. Shattered sound panels lay half buried in the dirt, and surrounding it all, crushed beneath the weight of heavy machinery, were the blooming gardenia bushes he had worked so hard to preserve. He stood in silence, breath caught in his throat, hands shaking at his sides. It wasn't just destruction, it was personal. A folded letter had been taped to his front door. It bore the HOA letterhead and a cold-type message: the HOA has removed unauthorized structures to maintain community harmony. Future violations will result in fines and potential legal action. No signature, no warning, no humanity. Thomas read it twice, then lowered it slowly. The scent of gardenias was thick in the air, sickly sweet, like a funeral bouquet. He walked the perimeter of the wreckage, the crushed earth crumbling under his boots. He touched a splintered beam still warm from sunlight, and then he turned, walked inside, and made a phone call. Not to the HOA, not to the police. He called someone else, someone who didn't flinch at bullies hiding behind fake rules and weaponized flower metaphors. His lawyer answered on the second ring. "I need you to come see something," Thomas said, voice low. "They destroyed everything." And as he hung up standing on the porch of a house surrounded by silence, in ruin, Thomas Beckett felt something stir in his chest. Not anger, not grief, but something sharper, something colder. It was the feeling of a man preparing to aim carefully this time, not with bullets, but with the law. The flowers might still bloom in Gardenia Grove, but there was a storm coming, and it had Thomas's name on it. The ground was still torn beneath Thomas Beckett's boots, the scent of crushed gardenias thick in the air, when his lawyer Malcolm Trent stepped out of his truck and surveyed the wreckage. He was a lean man in his 60s with a gaze that could cut granite and a handshake that meant war. After a long pause, he simply said, "They messed with the wrong man." That was all Thomas needed to hear. The battle had begun not with rifles or drills, but with affidavits, property statutes, and the kind of legal firepower that could shake the bones of any corrupt HOA board. Within the week, Malcolm filed a civil suit against the Gardenia Grove Homeowners Association for trespassing, destruction of private property, and criminal mischief under Georgia state law. They attached photos of the destroyed range, documentation of permits, legal property surveys, and witness testimony from nearby residents who had seen the bulldozers arrive. But the HOA didn't flinch. Instead, they doubled down. The next letter Thomas received was not from the court, but from the HOA's newly retained legal firm, a prestigious outfit in Atlanta, with a reputation for burying small clients in mountains of paperwork. It started slowly. A compliance fine for disturbing the landscape's aesthetic integrity, then another for unauthorized modification of soil elevation. The amounts were absurd: $1, $200, $2, $750. One even claimed he owed $4, $100 for excessive flower bed disturbance due to the temporary removal of shrubs during construction, despite photographic proof showing otherwise. Each envelope arrived with cold precision, addressed with smug formality, printed on glossy stationery, bearing the HOA's rose-shaped logo. At HOA meetings, Eleanor Granger now held court like a queen in bloom. She leaned into the microphone, warning residents of paramilitary behavior and a clear and present danger to the community's peace. She claimed Thomas had built a combat facility that threatened children's safety and depressed home values. And worst of all, some people started to believe her. A few neighbors stopped waving. One even crossed the street when Thomas walked by. The seed of fear had been planted, and Eleanor watered it daily with whispers and paranoia. But Thomas had faced worse. Much worse. He didn't panic. He got to work. One night, surrounded by case files and HOA documents, he stumbled upon something that shifted everything. A line buried in the bylaws, overlooked by most and likely forgotten by the board itself. This organization shall operate as a nonprofit corporation in accordance with state law, subject to member governance by majority vote or assigned proxy. That was it. The lever. The one pressure point that could unseat the tyrants who had destroyed his range and poisoned the community. Thomas dug deeper. Under Georgia law, nonprofit HOAs could be restructured or restaffed if a simple majority of voting members signed a petition requesting it. And voting power didn't just come from physical presence. It could come from property ownership or proxies. With Malcolm's help, Thomas laid out a strategy. Step 1, assess the battlefield. He built a spreadsheet of every home in Gardenia Grove who lived there, who had voting rights, and who had been wronged. There were more than he expected. Residents fined for planting sunflowers instead of tulips. Homeowners warned for using wooden flower boxes instead of pre-approved ceramic. An elderly couple forced to repaint their shed moss beige after planting pink hydrangeas. The more he asked, the more stories he heard. But he also learned to tread carefully. Some residents were afraid. Eleanor's grip on the HOA had grown ironclad, and those who spoke out had learned to expect retribution, petty citations, lawn inspections, even threats of lien placement. So Thomas changed his approach. He didn't talk about revenge. He talked about fairness, about restoring respect, not rewriting rules for chaos. He met quietly with neighbors over iced tea or evening strolls. He listened more than he spoke. Slowly, trust grew. Meanwhile, Malcolm tracked delinquent properties homes with unpaid dues or owners who had walked away during the housing crash. Many of them still had legal voting rights tied to them. Using a network of shell LLCs, Thomas began purchasing those rights. Sometimes he bought the liens. Other times, the land itself, shallow lots choked with weeds and old for sale signs. It was tedious, expensive, and utterly worth it. Every acquisition was a new vote. Every agreement a new brick in the foundation of a quiet rebellion. To mask the growing momentum, Thomas kept up appearances. He mowed his lawn. He waved politely at meetings. He paid the bogus fines, but made detailed records of each one. All the while, his coalition grew neighbors who felt stifled by the endless floral regulations and tired of living under threat of punishment for planting daisies too close to the curb. Eleanor began to sense it. At one meeting, she accused him of trying to undermine the beauty and order of Gardenia Grove. Thomas just smiled. "I believe in flowers, Eleanor," he said. "I just don't believe they should come with a price tag and a threat." After 5 long months of planning, organizing, and quiet alliances, Thomas was ready. With over 50% of the voting rights either acquired or assigned to his proxies, he submitted the formal petition to hold a special election to restructure the HOA board. He did it with no fanfare, just a plain envelope handed to the board secretary with the signature count attached. The next week was chaos. Eleanor called an emergency meeting. She declared the petition invalid, accused Thomas of fraud, and claimed his proxies were unverified. But Malcolm had anticipated every counter. They had documentation, notarized signatures, and legal precedent to back every claim. The HOA tried to pass emergency bylaw changes to raise the petition threshold, but it was too late. The law was on Thomas's side now, and the clock was ticking. Flyers appeared overnight, some pro-Thomas, others warning of rogue elements taking over the neighborhood. Anonymous emails accused him of wanting to build a gun range theme park, but his supporters held strong. The final week was the longest of Thomas's life. Then on a rainy Tuesday night, the Gardenia Grove Community Center was packed wall to wall. Some came angry, some came confused. Most came curious. Eleanor sat stiffly at the head of the table, flanked by board members who avoided eye contact. Thomas stood near the back, flanked by neighbors who had once been strangers but were now allies. The votes were cast on paper, folded and counted by a third-party notary under legal supervision. No one spoke. When the results were read aloud, the numbers were clear and devastating for the old guard. 67% voted in favor of removing the entire board. It wasn't close. The room was silent for a long moment. Then a single clap, then another, and then like a storm breaking through the clouds, cheers erupted. People hugged, some cried, a few just stood in disbelief, unsure of what had just happened. Eleanor gathered her papers with shaking hands. On her way out, she turned to Thomas. Her lips curled in contempt. "You've ruined everything," No, Thomas said softly. "I'm just getting started." That night as he drove home through the winding streets of Gardenia Grove, past the blooming azaleas and dew-soaked hedges, he didn't feel triumph. He felt resolve. He had won the vote. But justice wasn't a ballot. It was a reckoning. And for every gardenia torn from the soil, every right trampled under petty rules and smiling threats, that reckoning was coming. With Thomas Becket at the helm, Gardenia Grove was about to remember what real community looked like. And Eleanor Granger would never forget who taught them. The morning after the vote, the air in Gardenia Grove felt different, lighter somehow, as if the wind itself had taken a deep breath of relief. Thomas Becket stood at his kitchen window, sipping black coffee as he stared out across the yard, where the range used to be now just a field of churned earth and broken dreams. But this time it didn't sting, because now he had the power to rebuild not just with hammers and wood, but with truth, accountability, and justice. He had been elected president of the very HOA that tried to destroy him, and he didn't intend to waste a single moment. Within 48 hours of the election, Thomas called an emergency board meeting open to all residents. It was standing room only. No one wanted to miss what came next. As he stood before the crowd, he didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply read from a printed list, firm and clear. Effective immediately, he said, the following individuals are terminated from any and all roles within the Gardenia Grove Homeowners Association. He read each name slowly. Every board member, legal contractor, and compliance officer involved in the illegal demolition of his range. Your services, he said flatly, are no longer required. And then, like a man delivering justice with surgical precision, he added, termination notices will be hand-delivered, some by process servers. A few gasps rippled through the room. Most clapped. But Thomas wasn't done. The next day, he contracted a forensic accounting firm from Savannah, an outfit known not for its discretion, but its relentlessness. "We're not just auditing books," Thomas told the board. "We're tearing up the floorboards." Within 3 weeks, the results came in like a bombshell. The previous board had buried a decade of corruption beneath flowery language and landscape improvement grants. There were inflated maintenance contracts funneled through shell companies, massive overpayments to a cousin of Eleanor's for garden consulting, and 5-figure disbursements labeled simply floral beautification. Tens of thousands of dollars meant for community upkeep had vanished like dew in sunlight. Armed with the findings, Thomas handed everything over to the Georgia State Attorney General's office and the county DA. The investigations moved quickly. Subpoenas were issued, depositions were taken, and then one humid morning, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up to Eleanor Granger's rose-covered porch. Neighbors peeked through blinds as she was led away in handcuffs, her prized lavender scarf trailing behind her like a wilted petal. The HOA that once cowered under her shadow now watched in stunned silence as justice bloomed. But Thomas wasn't looking for revenge anymore. He was looking for restoration. The same week, Eleanor was indicted for embezzlement, conspiracy, and unlawful property destruction. Thomas broke ground on a new project, the Gardenia Range Rebuild Initiative. This time, the design would be grander, safer, and more accessible than ever. He hired top-tier contractors, engineers, and safety consultants, all funded legally and transparently with community approval. Local veterans even volunteered time and labor offering to help frame the new pavilion and pour reinforced concrete for the target lanes. The berms were rebuilt higher, wider, and planted along the back with dense rows of white jasmine and wild gardenia that swayed like silent sentinels in the breeze. Soundproofing walls were installed with double the thickness. An automated target retrieval system was added. A covered shooting pavilion went up next, roofed with weatherproof composite shingles and fitted with proper lighting for evening training. It was no longer just a private range. It was a symbol, a statement that rights could be reclaimed and rebuilt stronger than before. As construction neared completion, Thomas sent out invitations hand-delivered, signed with a simple message: "Come see what community looks like." The Gardenia Grove Range reopening celebration was held on a crisp Saturday in early October. Folding tables were set out beneath the trees covered in red checkered cloths and piled high with pulled pork, cornbread, potato salad, and iced tea so sweet it made your teeth hurt. There was live bluegrass from a local trio safety demonstrations by certified instructors, and for the kids, flower-themed paper targets they could color and pin to foam boards. But the centerpiece of the day wasn't the food or the music. It was the people. Families who once feared fines now smiled freely. Residents who had once stayed silent now stood shoulder to shoulder, laughing, sharing stories, and shaking Thomas's hand. Even some former critics, those who had once muttered about gun ranges and bad optics, came by, saw the meticulous safety measures, and quietly admitted they'd been wrong. A few even signed up for training sessions. As dusk fell and fairy lights blinked on across the lawn, Thomas stood at the new firing line, a rifle in hand. The steel target gleamed under the soft light, flanked by two blooming gardenia bushes, newly planted just that morning. He looked around at the crowd gathered behind him, veterans, single mothers, young couples, retirees, kids with plastic ear protection, and for the first time since the day his range was destroyed, he felt peace, real peace, the kind that's earned. He chambered around, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. A crisp shot rang out. The steel rang true, and the crowd erupted into applause. But Thomas knew that applause wasn't just for the shot. It was for everything that came before it: the fight, the grit, the refusal to back down. Still, he wasn't finished. In the months that followed, Thomas led a full-scale revision of the HOA bylaws. No more vague aesthetic harmony clauses. No more secret rule changes. No more unannounced fines for flower types or mailbox color. Instead, the new HOA charter included a homeowner's bill of rights, a clear declaration of freedoms, the right to use your land within the bounds of state law, the right to fair hearings, the right to petition, and most importantly, protection from arbitrary HOA actions. The charter was approved unanimously. Gardenia Grove changed, not just on paper but in spirit. Yards once manicured out of fear now bloomed with individuality. The HOA, once a tool of control, became a vehicle of service. And Thomas, he never wanted the title of president, but he kept it for a time, just long enough to make sure the roots of freedom had taken hold. News spread. Local outlets ran headlines: "Veteran cleans house in HOA takeover," and "The Gardenia Grove Revolution." Emails came in from across the state, homeowners looking for advice, communities asking for guidance. Thomas responded to everyone, not because he craved fame, but because he believed no one should fight alone. One afternoon, months later, he walked the path between his home and the range. The jasmine was blooming again, its scent mingling with the last of the season's gardenias. He paused, rested a hand on the wooden rail, and closed his eyes. The HOA hadn't just destroyed a structure. They had tried to bury a man's dignity under a pile of lies and bureaucracy. But he had risen not just for himself, but for every voice that had once been silenced in that flowered prison of rules and fear. As he stepped up to the firing line one more time, he didn't raise his rifle out of defiance, but out of gratitude. He lined up the shot, the familiar weight in his hands, steady and true, and fired. The steel rang out again, and with it a message echoed through Gardenia Grove. Freedom isn't just defended on foreign soil, it's protected at home, one principled stand at a time. In the quiet streets of Gardenia Grove, we witnessed a powerful truth. Injustice doesn't always come in the form of violence or noise. It can show up with a clipboard, a flower logo, and a smile hiding a sword. What happened to Thomas Becket is something many Americans have experienced in their own way: an overreaching HOA, a petty neighbor with too much power, or a system that punishes instead of protects. But this story wasn't just about destruction, it was about resilience. When Thomas returned to find his dream bulldozed and his dignity violated, he had a choice. He could have walked away. He could have let bitterness take root. Instead, he stood tall, studied the system, and used the very rules meant to suppress him to lead a revolution from within. He didn't just win a lawsuit, he changed a community. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Never underestimate your right to fight back with integrity, with intelligence, and with unity. Thomas didn't yell or threaten. He organized. He listened. He worked late nights while others slept. And because of that, Gardenia Grove went from a neighborhood of fear to a beacon of freedom and fairness. That's the kind of change that lasts. To our viewers across America, if you're facing unfair treatment, whether it's in your neighborhood, workplace, or anywhere else, know this: you have more power than you think. The law is not just for those in suits or behind desks. It belongs to all of us. Stand firm, do your homework, build alliances, and never let bullies in positions of petty power convince you that you don't belong. At US Justice Story, we tell these stories not just to entertain, but to empower. Because somewhere out there, another Thomas is watching. Another homeowner is wondering if they should give up or push forward. And to that person, we say, push forward. Always. Thank you for listening, for caring, and for being part of a growing community that believes in standing up when something isn't right. We appreciate every one of you who shares comments and spreads these stories because every view, every voice, and every act of awareness matters. Stay strong, stay informed, and remember justice doesn't just happen in courtrooms. Sometimes it blooms in your own backyard.